Today we'll be looking at a case from the mid-18th century, so sit back as we go to England. Elizabeth Parry was born in 1672 in Bristol, a city positioned near the River Avon, about 120 miles west of London. She enjoyed a privileged upbringing. Her father, initially a ship surgeon, steadily ascended through the ranks to become a highly esteemed shipmaster. Through his dedication at sea, he secured a prosperous lifestyle for his family. He made sure that Elizabeth received an education befitting a shipmaster's daughter. In the 1670s, formal education for girls was limited and took place in the home of those families who had the means to hire a tutor. Girls would study subjects like music, dance, language and literature, which were regarded by wealthier families as indispensable for cultivating an air of sophistication appropriate to their social standing. During Elizabeth's teenage years, Bristol was bustling with maritime activity. As one of England's leading ports, it served as a hub for the import and export of goods, particularly tobacco and sugar. The city's economy flourished, fueling the growth of industries such as shipbuilding and manufacturing. However, amongst the commercial prosperity, social divisions were evident, with a wealthier merchant class dominating the city's affairs, while a growing population of labourers and the lower classes faced many challenges. The religious and political tensions of the era added further complexity to daily life in Bristol. Despite this, the city's vibrant culture thrived. There were theatres, taverns and coffee houses that provided venues for entertainment and social activity. In 1688, when Elizabeth was 16 years old, the King, James II, was peacefully overthrown and replaced by his Protestant daughter, Mary II, and her Dutch husband, William III of Orange. This secured Protestantism and constitutional monarchy in England and led to the passage of the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Elizabeth married Mr. Benjamin Branch, a landholding farmer. She came with a substantial dowry of £2,000, which supplemented Mr. Branch's income of £300 per year. At the time, it was important for a young lady to bring a dowry into marriage for both economical security and social status, as not only did the dowry ensure the financial stability of the bride, it also reflected her family's wealth. The couple lived in a nice house in the village of Hemmington, in the beautiful county of Somerset. However, Elizabeth's husband soon realised the grave mistake he had made in choosing her as his wife. Upon assuming her role in the household, she wasted no time in asserting her authority. It seemed that the sweet young bride had transformed overnight into a tyrant who ruled over her servants with a merciless hand. Her treatment of them was not just harsh, but shockingly callous and usually unjustifiable. She often denied them even the most basic necessities, and in moments of vindictiveness, ejected them from the house in the bitter cold of winter nights. However, despite this reign of terror, Mr. Benjamin Branch stood in stark contrast to his wife. He had always been known in the village for his caring nature, and always made sure that his staff's wages were paid, despite Mrs. Branch's unpredictable and often cruel behaviour. Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, and the couple named her Elizabeth after her mother, but always referred to her as Betty. In her early years, Betty displayed a gentle nature like that of her father. However, as she matured into adolescence, the darker aspects of her personality emerged. Her once sweet disposition gave way to a cold and calculating demeanour, mirroring the cruel and callous traits of her mother. Together, Elizabeth and her daughter started to run the house. They both harboured a shared capacity for cruelty and imposed their will upon all who lived there. They showed little mercy to those who dared to challenge their authority. When Elizabeth's husband, Mr. Benjamin Branch, died in 1730, the estate fell into her hands. Now, along with her daughter, she continued to run the house in her cruel and uncompromising manner. Her behaviour became increasingly more oppressive, so much so that servants who were able to find other positions left Mrs. Branch's employment, unwilling to endure the tyranny of their mistress any longer. Those who remained behind whispered tales of horror and misery, painting a vivid picture of the legacy of fear and loathing that Elizabeth Branch and her daughter had created within the walls of their once respected home. Mrs. Branch's husband had met his demise under circumstances that fueled suspicion among many in the village. There were those who suggested that she had administered poison to him, which had led to his untimely passing. Furthermore, local gossip hinted at a darker past, with whispers alleging that she had also been involved in the death of her own mother. All of these rumours increased when human remains were unearthed from a well situated in Mrs. Branch's property. Speculation mounted, with many surmising that these bones belonged to one of her previous servant girls, who had vanished some years earlier and whose fate had been shrouded in mystery ever since. These unsettling discoveries only served to deepen the sense of unease and suspicion that lingered over Mrs. Elizabeth Branch. Due to her unfavourable reputation in the area, she encountered challenges in finding suitable female staff who were willing to work for her. Consequently, when the need arose, she would go to Bristol. She knew that there were many girls and young ladies who would welcome the opportunity to leave the city to live and work in her house in the picturesque village of Hemington. On one occasion, she enlisted the services of a young apprentice girl, 13-year-old Miss Jane Buttersfierld. However, as soon as the girl entered the house, she was immediately engulfed by an atmosphere of strictness and severity. Mrs. Branch and her daughter wasted no time in subjecting young Jane to a harsh and unyielding regime, instilling discipline with a heavy hand from the very outset. The 13th of February 1740 was a bitterly cold day in the village of Hemington, mirroring the harsh winter that had descended upon the entire country. It all began the preceding October, which had been marked by the arrival of unyielding easterly winds that draped the land in thick blankets of frost. Subsequent months bore witness to relentless cold, as severe frost seized the landscape and persisted day and night. By mid-February, the freeze showed no signs of relenting. That afternoon, Mrs. Branch sent young Jane Buttersfield to the shops to buy some yeast. However, Jane did not hurry back. Instead, she stayed longer than was necessary. When she did eventually return, Mrs. Branch was not at all pleased. However, Jane excused her lateness to the mistress by telling a lie. Not believing what the young girl was saying, Mrs. Branch's daughter Betty hit her on the head and pinched her ears. Then they both threw the young girl on the ground, and while Betty knelt on her, Mrs. Branch whipped the 13-year-old girl with twigs. It was soon evident that she was badly hurt, and there was blood coming from a wound to her head. Nevertheless, Betty took off one of the girl's shoes and started to beat her with it in a particularly cruel manner. Jane cried for mercy, but the punishment was unrelenting. After a struggle, she managed to escape into the parlour, but Mrs. Branch and her daughter followed, and the assault continued with broomsticks until poor Miss Jane Buttersfierld collapsed. In an attempt to remove the blood from the young girl's face and clothes, Betty threw a pail of water over her. All this was witnessed by another young servant girl named Miss Anne James, who, realising the seriousness of the situation, departed and went to milk the cows. Following the assault, Mrs. Branch and her daughter attempted to rouse the young girl. However, a grim realisation slowly settled over them. Their young apprentice lay still, and it soon became tragically apparent that she was dead. Half an hour later, Miss Anne James returned and was surprised to see her mistress seated by the fire, with Jane's lifeless body lying on the floor. What struck her immediately was the sight of a fresh, clean cap on the girl's head, a stark contrast to when she had left to milk the cows. However, she noticed that blood had started to seep through it. Mrs. Branch now needed to cover up her heinous crime, so along with Betty, she placed the body on the bed and instructed Anne James to sleep beside the deceased girl. The following day, Mrs. Branch sent for the undertaker, Mr. William Budd, and instructed him to measure for a coffin, but making sure that he did not see the cuts and bruises on Jane Buttersfield's body. Following his visit to Mrs. Branch's house, Mr. Budd went to see the church sexton, a gentleman named Francis Coombs. He asked him to toll the bell, as a girl had died, and it was usual to toll the bell following a person's death. Mrs. Branch told her other servant girl Anne James, that she must never say anything about how she punished Jane. On Sunday the 17th of February, a man named John Lawrence arrived and placed the body in the coffin. The girl had been dressed and laid out, so the cuts and bruises would not show. Later that day, 13-year-old Jane Buttersfierld was buried in the local churchyard. After the burial, Mrs. Branch inquired of Mr. Coombs about the depth in which he had buried the coffin. Mr. Coombs calmly responded that he had dug a yard down. Mrs. Branch was not pleased by his response and told him that this was inadequate. However, Mr. Coombs reassured her, explaining that it was indeed deep enough and that he had taken good care to properly cover the coffin. Although Mrs. Branch had managed to have the young girl buried in the graveyard, shielded from prying eyes, there were rumours in the village that there had been a murder at the house. However, 10 days passed before two gentlemen named John Marchant and Robert Carver decided that they needed to find out exactly what had caused the death of young Jane Buttersfield. On Tuesday the 26th of February, they were granted permission to exhume the body. Once the coffin had been dug up, it was taken to the church, and despite its lid being securely fastened, they managed to pry it open. It had been agreed beforehand that if no signs of harm were evident on the young girl, they would promptly lay her to rest again. Prior to lifting the lid, the men had invited several women to examine the body. As the women looked at the deceased girl, the men withdrew to the back of the church. Following the inspection, it was unanimously concluded that the corpse exhibited significant bruising, which cast suspicion upon the tragic circumstances of the young girl's demise. The lid was gently replaced on the coffin, and Mr. Craddock, the warden, locked the church doors. The following morning, Mr. Carver, the local constable, and a few parishioners proceeded to the residence of Mrs. Elizabeth Branch. Mr. Marchant inquired about the circumstances surrounding the girl's demise, which prompted Mrs. Branch to recount that she had fallen down a flight of stairs. He then asked who had laid out the body. Mrs. Branch paused for a moment before saying that she had. When questioned as to why she had not fetched the usual women from the village to undertake the task, she said that she was not very much liked by them. Mr. Marchant then asked if she had noticed wounds on the body, to which she replied that she had not. Dr. Salmon inspected the dead girl and declared that she had received several wounds, almost any of which could have proved fatal. An inquest was then quickly arranged to be held in the church. While the inquest was taking place, Mr. William Coombs went with the other servant girl, Miss Anne James, to look for evidence in the house of Mrs. Branch. Although he found no blood-stained clothes, there was a small amount of blood on a coat found in the kitchen and blood on the floor of the parlour. Anne James then gave the gentleman the sticks that she said had been used to beat the girl. She conveyed to Mr. Coombs that they now bore no traces of blood, as her mistress had ordered her to thoroughly clean them. Following the inquest, it was determined that Miss Jane Buttersfierld had been murdered and that Mrs. Elizabeth Branch and her daughter Betty would face trial for the crime. The trials of Elizabeth and Betty Branch took place on the 31st of March 1740 at the Somerset Assizes in the town of Taunton, and was presided over by the Honourable Mr. Justice Chappell. Both women denied the charges against them. Mrs. Elizabeth Branch told the court how she had taken in Miss Jane Buttersfierld when the girl was destitute. She said that she gave her a home, food, clothes, and would never have raised a hand against her. It was suggested that it was in fact the other girl, Miss Anne James, who mistreated Jane. One witness, named Anne Paradise, said that Jane had told her that she could live well enough in Mrs. Branch's house if it were not for Anne James. She added that Jane had often complained about the harsh treatment Miss James put on her, but she had never heard her complain about the mistress. The defence told the jury that prior to being arrested, both of the defendants could have easily left the property and escaped to London or Bristol, but as they were innocent, they never thought that they would be charged with this most terrible crime. Anne James, however, told a very different story. In her testimony, she revealed the depths of Elizabeth Branch and her daughter's depravity. She said that they often treated their staff to violent assaults and savage beatings. adding that their treatment of Jane Buttersfierld knew no bounds, culminating in the final act of brutality that robbed the young girl of her life. However, strangely, Mr. George Hayne, the coroner, informed the court that when young Anne James was brought before him, he asked her if she knew how the deceased girl had come to her death, to which she replied that she did not. He asked her to swear it, and she answered the same. The trial lasted for 6 hours, and when the jury deliberated, they returned a verdict of guilty. The judge then sentenced Mrs. Elizabeth Branch and her daughter to death by hanging. When the sentence was pronounced, Mrs. Branch displayed minimal emotion. Instead, in a composed tone, she remarked that the trial had not been heard in front of an impartial jury, and addressing the judge directly, she said, "Had we been tried by a fair jury, we would not have been convicted." Many people were surprised by the verdict, as Mrs. Branch was a wealthy woman, and they never believed that she would meet her end on the gallows. They were taken to Taunton to await their execution. Before being hanged, Mrs. Elizabeth Branch confessed her crime, while her 24-year-old daughter wept openly by her side. As many people were outraged at what they had done, it was decided that they would be executed very early in the morning to stop the angry mob from executing their own justice. On the 3rd of May, they left their cell at 4 a.m. However, when they arrived at the execution sites, it was found that the gallows had been cut down. A carpenter had to be sent for to put another one up. This delayed proceedings, which meant that some people managed to arrive before the hanging took place. However, both mother and daughter were executed before 6 o'clock and then left to hang for over an hour, while a stream of clergymen lectured those who had witnessed the execution on the evils of beating servants. Apparently, the small crowd was not particularly interested in the sermons and was only concerned with ensuring that the pair had been properly dispatched. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case